tax is a really big deal. We spend quite a lot of our time talking about the specific ways in which the government spends its money, which is quite important, but a lot less time talking about the specific ways that it raises money in the first place, which is a bit surprising when you think that the government is raising over £700 billion each year. That's 35% of national income. And in fact, tax isn't just important because it represents the government raising and spending over 1 in 3 of every pound in the UK economy. Governments also use the structure of the tax system to redistribute incomes and to manipulate various forms of behaviour. So both how much we raise in tax and how we raise it are absolutely central to shaping the kind of society we have. Now, on the how much we raise, that's been increasing in recent years and is now at a high since a peak at the end of the 60s. Going forward, there are important debates to be had about whether we should raise more tax to fund a set of public services that are under increasingly visible strain and an ageing population that demands both more and more expensive health and social care. So you can see from this chart that high levels of tax would be kind of unusual for us historically, but they wouldn't be unusual internationally. Tax at 35% of national income puts us just below the OECD average, and we could clearly raise quite a lot more and still have a state that was smaller than many of our European neighbours. Moving to how we raise tax, we get 60% of revenue from just 3 taxes: income tax, national insurance contributions, and VAT. And in fact, most developed economies get most of their revenue from these 3 broad-based taxes. Those who get more than us tend to get even more in VAT, usually through having fewer zero rates, and even more through social security contributions, including more from both higher and middle income earners. If we look back at this, then you can see these taxes have been our big revenue raisers for decades, but you shouldn't let this seeming stability in revenues lead you to think we haven't changed taxes. In this time, we've moved away from specific taxes on sales and more than doubled the VAT rate. We've had income tax rates as high as 98%. We have reformed the taxation of saving and made many other important changes to tax rates and tax bases. And what we at the IFS have been keeping an eye on is what those changes do to the efficiency of our system. Effectively, what are the costs that our system imposes over and above the revenues it raises? Now, the idea that tax design is important is not a new one. Adam Smith was talking about it over 200 years ago. But as Paul said, it's been central to why the IFS exists. Early on, John worked on an IFS committee on tax reform and then wrote the great book that Paul mentioned. More recently, we've had our Merley's review, which updates the ideas of tax design for the new century. And right across our 50 years, we've been doing empirical research on how companies and firms respond to various parts of the tax system. And after all that, as you'd hope, we actually know quite a lot about what a well-designed tax system looks like and quite a lot about where ours falls short. So we have made some improvements, but actually in preparing for this talk, I couldn't think of a tax whose design couldn't be improved. To give just a sort of a flavour of that, we have a VAT base that is a treasure trove of silliness. I find it particularly amusing that we zero rate gingerbread men unless they're decorated, then we add 20%. We have an alcohol tax schedule that makes cider the most tax-efficient way to get drunk. And the one that I'm surprised doesn't upset more people is that we put a hefty tax penalty on employees. And actually, these are just 3 examples of very many where we put very different tax rates on very similar activities for no good reason. And that leads to obvious issues around fairness. So, for example, why should an employed economist who likes to, her alcohol derived from grapes pay more tax than a self-employed economist who likes the apple-based variety? But more broadly, these choices lead to various forms of inefficiency, and they lead people to basically make undesirable choices. So choices that aren't the result of some well-thought-through plan, but that ultimately are undesirable side effects that make people worse off. So what does all this mean for the future? I think one thing it means is that we have no shortage of problems to start solving. These problems are not going away on their own. Today's problems will become tomorrow's problems. And in fact, some of them are getting worse. If you think about the stories you hear about tax, take our business rates killing the high street, they're often pitched as new problems in need of new solutions, when actually they're old problems that just stem from bad design that just happen to be appearing in a certain way right now. If we want to future-proof our system, I think a really good place to start would be to work down the long list of problems we have and start getting some of them fixed. Now, for tonight, I'm going to resist the urge to drag you through a long list of problems. There are far too many for a short talk. And anyway, it's what most of you will hear us talking about most of the time. Instead, what I want to highlight is the kind of big overarching challenge for us going forward is how do we get things fixed? It's kind of all very well knowing the technical solutions, but if you want to reap the returns to a good, well-designed tax system, we have to see more of those ideas turning into policy. That's not a new challenge, but one that I don't think is any less important, and one that we're going to come back to discuss on the panel. With the rest of my time, I want to look forward to some of the ways in which the economy is changing. Now, I don't expect that to radically change where we get revenues from. I think NICs, income tax, and VAT will be our big revenue raisers across the next 50 years. But the economy will change in ways that might make it harder to tax some things, or might make us want to make different choices about what we're taxing. Now, given tax is such a big topic, there are clearly plenty of issues I could have picked. So, for example, the ageing of society, the changing nature of work, the desire for more devolved tax powers. But I've decided to pick three that I think are particularly high up for public debate at the moment. And I'm doing that because ultimately, although I think it's highly desirable to have a well-designed tax system that's robust to all sorts of future changes, it's not enough. We also have to have a system that's socially acceptable. And in achieving that, I think a good place to start is by looking at our options in these big areas of key public debate. So the first change I'm going to cover tonight is globalization. Now, actually, the kind of increasingly connected nature of the world has always posed a challenge for tax systems, basically because we have national institutions that set taxes based on people or activities within their borders, and that's just harder to do if those people can move across borders. For one thing, it means you have to spend more effort trying to stop avoidance and evasion, for example, stopping the rich stashing their cash offshore. But you also have to consider how tax affects real behaviours, like where people live or where they invest. I think these issues have played out most obviously for the corporation tax, where basically since inception there have been concerns about our ability to tax mobile investments and predictions of race to the bottom in corporate tax rates. The UK corporation tax rate has been cut to a third of its 1980s level. Rates have also been cut in other advanced economies, and there's evidence that to at least some degree this is the result of government tax competition. Actually, to the surprise of many, revenues, despite fluctuating with the economic cycle, have held up for most of that period. Now, that's partly because we changed the tax base in ways that mean that more income is now subjected to corporation tax, but we also just got lucky. Revenues were buoyed first by the North Sea and later by an increasingly profitable financial sector. Now, in coming years, we'll have to continue to make choices about what the corporate tax rate should be. But I think the bigger challenge for the future, and certainly the one that's at the heart of public debates, is how do we want to tax the profits of multinationals? So which part of profits do we want to try to tax here in the UK? And I think you can see why that's a challenge and why there's not an obvious right answer by considering how we currently do it. Take the example of an iPhone. I suspect you all know that Apple is headquartered in the US and that the original smartphone was designed and developed in Silicon Valley. But the final product is assembled in China, and its production sucks in components from literally around the globe, including displays from Japan, sensors from South Korea, and gyroscopes from a French-Italian company based in Switzerland. And actually, many of our biggest corporations, which is where we get lots of revenue and investment from, have these very globally integrated production networks. And of course, all of the countries in which they operate want a share of the profits. And the way we share those out is to use a set of international rules that, very broadly and crudely described, try to allocate profits to different countries according to how much each part of production contributes to the final value of a product or a service, which is remarkably hard to do, even in principle. And it's been getting harder, first as intangible assets and more recently as digital services have become more important. So think about the big tech giants, maybe take Facebook as an example. There's a growing debate now about whether we shouldn't just be considering the location of where the Facebook brand or the Facebook software or how valuable those things are, but also how valuable they are relative to the data and content added by users. And you can see why all those countries that have users based in them would like that. They'd like more Facebook profits flowing towards them. But I don't think it's feasible that we can ever hope to accurately answer the question of how valuable all these groups of users are relative to everything else Facebook does. So this is a complicated system. But stepping back, it's worth remembering that corporation tax is still a pretty significant revenue raiser, and we have had successes in patching it up. So we could just keep running this system. But I think it's worth saying that no matter how much we keep patching it up, and no matter how complicated we make it to accommodate digital services, we're still going to have a system that has a fundamental problem, which is that it gives firms an incentive to move real activities and profits in response to tax. And precisely because it gives firms those incentives, governments have an incentive to compete with tax rates. That is the source of the concern about the race to the bottom. And I don't think we can rely on countries all clubbing together to agree on a new, more robust solution to tax multinationals, because there is absolutely no way close to agreement across countries on what a robust and fair allocation would look like. And whenever you do change the allocation in a large way, you end up creating big losers. So they're unlikely to want to sign up to this coordinated approach. If we wanted to, then we could unilaterally move away from this system. Effectively, we could stop trying to pin down the very hard to measure, very mobile parts of a company, and instead tax company profits according to activities that were less mobile, for example, the location of consumers. I think for now that probably feels a little bit radical for most people. But if we keep seeing globalization and technology making our tax base more mobile, then those more radical solutions might start to look more attractive in future. So that was the first change. The second change I want to flag tonight is rising incomes of the top 1%. Now, actually, when IFS was founded, incomes at the top have been coming down pretty quickly. Since then, the top have been racing away from the rest of us again. That's a pattern that's repeated across English-speaking countries, and I think one that's led to these growing calls to get more tax from the top. In the UK, the rate of income tax has come down substantially since the 70s. But despite this, the revenue we get from the top has been rising. Now, that's largely the result of growing inequality. There is just more income at the top to be taxed. Although in recent years, we've also made policy changes that effectively allow us to get more from the very highest earners just without putting up their top marginal rates. And one implication of these changes is that we're actually already pretty reliant on a fairly small group. We get 28% of income tax revenues from just 1% of income taxpayers. That means that regardless of how you feel about the very rich, if they have a bad year, or if they move their income or themselves out of the UK, that can be pretty bad for the government finances. But actually, even if we were happy to take on the risk of being more reliant on this group, it turns out that if you just increase top marginal income tax rates, you often don't raise as much income as you might expect. To give you an example of that, in the 2017 Labour Party manifesto, the Labour Party proposed extending the 45% rate of income tax to incomes above £80,000. That would affect the top 2% of adults in the UK. And to have a new 50p rate above £123,000, affecting the top 1% of adults. But actually, even the Labour Party expected that around 40% of the revenue that you might be able to raise would be lost to behavioural response. And actually, looking at the evidence, we thought that looks kind of optimistic. And in fact, the very rich might respond enough so that those policies raise nothing. And one of the kind of keys to understanding that large response and why it's hard to forecast revenues from these kinds of changes is that when you put up top rates, it can mean that you don't only fail to get the extra revenue you wanted, but that you also lose some or all of the revenue you were previously getting. As an example of that, Scotland recently increased their higher rate of tax to 41%. That's just 1 percentage point higher than the rest of the UK. And the OBR predicted that as a result, about 10% of the potential revenue will be lost if fewer than 20 people move their tax residence to the rest of the UK. So an example where you don't need very many people to respond to get these quite large effects. Now, you still might want to put up the top rate. For example, some would like to see higher top rates to directly reduce inequality or to indirectly reduce inequality by shaping incentives. For example, the incentives that the very highly paid have to bargain over very big pay packets. So it is important to consider the top rate we set because to at least some degree, the tax system we have today will shape the economy we have tomorrow. But I think it all still means if we're looking for really big sources of revenue, we're going to have to look elsewhere. Which leads me on to the kind of third change I wanted to highlight tonight, which is wealth. UK households hold around £13 trillion of wealth, and that's been growing pretty strongly in recent years. And I think when people hear that wealth is very large and it's been growing quite a lot, many of them are quite surprised to hear that we get most of our revenue from taxing consumption and labour income, and they'd like to see much higher taxes coming on these big stocks of wealth. But actually, the fact that we don't have very big taxes on stocks of wealth isn't as counterintuitive as it might sound. If we tax incomes when they're first earned, and then we tax the same income, which just happens to be sitting in a bank or a house or another asset, we can discourage savings and investment. And it's unfair to those people who just want to sort of save and consume in the future rather than do their spending today. But that doesn't mean we should just ignore wealth altogether. In fact, in the same way we think about how we tax incomes that flow from work, we should be thinking hard about how we tax incomes that flow from wealth. And when we get this wrong, there can be pretty big consequences. So if we take housing, property is over a third of wealth in the UK. But for many of those people who are sitting there with very large capital gains on their houses, they'll pay absolutely no tax on those gains. This is effectively a policy mistake that not only inefficiently skews investment towards housing, it's also unfair to all those people who got their income in other ways and did have to pay tax. Thinking about the rest of wealth, the majority of which is private pensions, that tends not to be taxed as generously as owner-occupied housing, but it is the case that we tax capital incomes at significantly lower rates than labour incomes. Now, that's causing some particular concerns right now around intergenerational fairness, because it just so happens that the large property gains and the large pension pots are sitting with the baby boom generation, who sort of happen to be in the right place at the right time. Looking forward, the younger generations don't look set to be anywhere near as wealthy. But actually, the fact that we have these very different tax rates on different types of capital income and different rates on capital and labour income is a problem at any point in time, and it leads to all sorts of equity and efficiency issues. Thinking about changing how we tax capital incomes would be pretty high up my list of things we should fix today. But fixing doesn't just mean increasing rates. It's really important that we get the tax base right too, because it's adjusting the tax base effectively allows us to raise rates without having other negative effects. Now, the way we treat pensions, by which I mean let people save out of their untaxed income and then tax income when it finally flows to them, is one broad way that we can both tax the returns to wealth, returns to capital, without discouraging saving or distorting other decisions. But we can use the same design principles for thinking about how we tax other capital assets. And if we wanted to, in changing how we tax capital incomes, we could raise more income. Now, we shouldn't be expecting to raise so much more that we radically reshape where we get revenue from, but we could raise more, especially if we're willing to look at the big sources of wealth. Again, if we wanted to, we could also target those changes towards those with the highest wealth or towards the intergenerational concerns. So, for example, we could reduce the tax breaks on pension income, which predominantly benefit those with the largest pensions. And actually, I think it's worth saying that even, regardless of how much revenue we wanted to raise, fixing how we tax capital incomes today would have the kind of nice side effect of helping future-proof our system. I expect many of you will have heard the concerns, I think popularised by the economist Thomas Piketty, that the returns to wealth are going to grow faster than the returns to labour, so faster than wages in future, therefore driving ever increasing inequality. Others worry about robots becoming much more important, which basically means bigger incomes flowing to the people who invested in those robots. Now, economists aren't agreed on exactly how returns to wealth are likely to evolve in future, but fixing today how we tax capital incomes would make any of those futures less problematic. Finally, on wealth, I've spent time thinking about how we tax the flows from wealth, but we do have a tax that taxes at least some forms of wealth when they're passed on at death. Now, polls consistently show that most people across the political spectrum think inheritance tax is unfair, much more so than for other taxes. And this is despite the fact that only 4% of deaths result in an inheritance tax bill. To steal John's phrase, inheritance tax favours the healthy, wealthy and well-advised, but it is still the case that most of the revenue comes from millionaires. So if we wanted to, we could look again at inheritance tax as a way to try to stop the transmission of intergenerational inequality. And we could look at some of the practical issues around how we design inheritance tax, but I suspect it still wouldn't be a vote winner, which to my mind means we should be even more careful when taxing people sensibly while they're still alive. So they're my three issues for tonight that I said I've picked because I think they're particularly high up the political agenda right now, the public debate right now. There are many others we could have talked about. To kind of bring everything together, taking what I've said, I think there are two things worth drawing out. The first is that tax design really matters. It isn't going to let us avoid the difficult political decisions like how big the state should be and who should be paying, but it does give us more options and allows us to make choices at lower costs. I think it also shows us that many of the new challenges we're seeing aren't new at all, meaning we don't need to start from scratch in inventing solutions. Often just fixing bad design would do the job. The second thing to say is that I think ultimately we all want a tax system that raises enough money in a way that's fair, efficient, and robust to the future. Now, people like us at IFS can do the efficient and robust bit, but ultimately, in getting those ideas into a system and creating a system that's deemed to be fair, we're always going to need a really high-quality public debate on tax. Thank you.